Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessica Devereaux in Baltimore. The U.S. State Department has released images showing a satellite image that purports to show self-propelled artillery only found in Russian military units on the Russian side of the border, oriented in the direction of a Ukrainian military unit within Ukraine. The United States says the images back up its claims that rockets have been fired from Russia into eastern Ukraine. Officials said the heavy weapons fired between July 21st and July 26th, which happened after the downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. Now joining us to discuss all of this is our guest, Derek Monroe. He's an independent journalist who writes for the Institute for Policy Studies, Foreign Policy in Focus. Thanks for joining us, Derek.
It's good to be here.
So, Derek, Moscow has already come out saying they've angrily denied allegations of Russian involvement in eastern Ukraine. But what do you make of these new developments, these new images?
Well, it's really an eye of the beholder. First of all, you have to understand that some of the elemental web pieces which are actually being presented to the public as justification of Russia's involvement are also found in different militaries. Older pieces are also part of the Ukrainian military, where there are different reports of different units that affected the rebels bringing the equipment with them, not only artillery, but tanks and other pieces of heavy equipment. So there's possibility here that what's being presented is truthful, but however, also there's possibility where we are being fed misinformation here. One thing you have to also understand that Ukrainian military has been considered, even by its own government, to be very ineffectual and well corrupted, with a variety of different pieces of weaponry being sold worldwide on the black market. Even got to the point where there was a film, I don't know if you remember, 10 years back about the great Russian weapon smuggler that was arrested in Johannesburg. Was played by Nicolas Cage, where a situation was that he would basically go into the bases, Ukrainian military bases, just after the fall of the Soviet Union, and would buy the whole military equipment wholesale to be sold to different countries. So right now, at this point, it's very difficult to say whether the images being presented here are, first of all, coming from Russia themselves, as far as territory is concerned, also coming from Ukrainian side.
So it's basically the fog of war, a lot of uncertainty, it sounds like.
Unfortunately, it is, and I think at the best, the arguments which are being brought in by photos actually are at the best, very speculative.
All right. What about the media? How do you think they've been portraying this? Because the Malaysian Airlines Flight 17, there's an investigation ongoing right now, but there have been lots of talks on the U.S. side, at least, pointing the finger at Russia right now.
Well, I think there's also it seems that U.S. media in general has really reached a pre-gone conclusion as who's at fault here. But there's quite possible that the military book system, which the anti-aircraft missiles, which actually were perpetrated to bring down the airliner, were brought in from Russian military or from Russian sources into the rebels' hands. However, what is also not being discussed about, which I think is extremely disingenuous on part of the major U.S. media, is simply there are two questions. Why was the flight originated from Amsterdam going into Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, going over the hot military zone? This is really something which is unspeakable as far as the normal routine of overflights of passenger flights. And our second question, which can be asked, which is not answered also, why would the Ukrainian civilian authorities basically approve flying flight like this? And also, why would they allow the Malaysian airliner to enter its airspace over the quote-unquote military hot zone? So two questions which are truly not being asked or answered. And I think this is, if you really look a little bit deeper in those issues, you would probably get a lot of answers from it.
All right. Let's talk more about what I mentioned at the beginning, Moscow, and how they've come out angrily denying any sort of allegations and connections to the separatists. But why don't they? If they are, why don't they just openly support them?
Well, first of all, you have to also look at the issue from very much a Russian political domestic scene. As much as the popularity of Putin is concerned, which is basically at this point the highest of any other elected leader in the Western world, not to mention probably the whole worldwide, which hovers around 80-some%. There are very strong ties, economic and trade ties with Western Europe, as well as the other Western companies. So fundamentally putting the issues up on sort of a nice edge where there's a conflict between Russian interests and international interests, in this case Western interests, is not very productive for further development of the trade and commercial trade situation, as well as the basically balance of payments from that, which is actually being outgoing from Russia in rather record tempo since the whole conflict in Ukraine began. So one thing has to really be also not appreciated enough, I think, in U.S. media is simply the degree where variety of different points which are being brought forward by a variety of different U.S. media outlets or international media outlets is simply putting things in a much black and white perspective. It's quite possible that the Kremlin is using its economic and political power in order to support, at least morally, if not say logistically, the developments in Ukraine as far as the rebel side is concerned. But it's also very dangerous to see, from the Russian perspective, further escalation of the conflict in Ukraine, because this, the stabilization of the country itself on its eastern border is really not productive to Russian interests. It's also not very productive for the Western interests. So it's quite possible where the military is coming from, it can be debatable. As I said before, there were different reports of military units from Ukrainian army being defecting to the rebel side, most of the Russian speaking side, and basically using their equipment with them. They include tanks, include rockets. I'm not sure at this point they're anti-aircraft rockets systems, which are rather complex. But this, and also one thing which just cannot be emphasized strong enough, at the beginning of the conflict, a variety of different military and weapons depots were really raided by rebel side, and a lot of military equipment has been carted away. So at this point, it's really hard to tell where the equipment is really coming from, if there's any ineffectual and practical support as far as training, as far as arming.
Yeah.
At this point, it's very speculative. So I would say I would reserve my judgment till there's some real facts to really come to the light.
Derek, you mentioned how this would not be productive for the Russian side and the Western side to be continuing this conflict. Can you just speak to specific examples? What do you mean by that?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to look at a situation from humanitarian perspective. You're talking about a nation of 45 million people, which basically going to be put in a similar situation like in Iraq, where there's a perennial civil war. So you have a huge degree of out of population from east, and eventually, as the conflict would spread to the west. So this even got in a situation where in the western part of the European Union, in Poland, for example, there have been widely reported movements of the Polish authorities to convert hospitals and convert schools into the makeshift refugee centers for people coming from their east. So this is one thing. Economically, also, there has been a huge degree of hoopla, which actually started this whole situation in Ukraine as far as the association agreement with the European Union, of creating the new economic reality in Ukraine, where they would basically become more of a transparent market economy with help of IMF, specifically to the tune of 15 or 20 billion dollars, which they were supposed to receive as far as the revamp of their economy is concerned. Nothing's really has changed at this point, and politically and economically, as it is right now, despite of successful elections in Ukraine, although some people would basically deride its success because of the variety of different problems in the East, and also the fact that the Eastern part did not participate in the last election. The problem is simply that the government is facing a sort of a no-win situation. The further the situation will escalate militarily, the lesser there's chance of a political resolution of the issue. And what's really can happen at the end would be a de facto partition of the country between the eastern side and the western side, which I think is pretty much detrimental for anyone who's an honest broker in this case, because I think every conscientious and honest person would like to have Ukraine stay as a one economic and political unit. Because ultimately, this should be for Ukrainian people to decide on a peaceful basis, not in wearing arms. But this is something that I think that just unfortunately escalated to the point of no return in many cases.
All right, Derek Monroe, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.